December 26, 1776. The snow-covered banks of the Delaware River, Trenton, New Jersey. When Colonel Johann Rahl's adjutant, Lieutenant Jakob Piel, pushed open the stable doors at the Potts farmstead that morning, he expected to find his regiment's cavalry mounts restless after the previous night's chaos. Instead, he discovered something that would haunt Hessian military records for the next 2 centuries. 103 horses stood perfectly still in their stalls, upright, eyes open, frozen solid where they stood. The animals' breath had crystallized on their muzzles. Ice formed delicate patterns across their flanks. Some still had feet in their mouths, frozen mid-chew. They looked alive, as if at any moment they might blink, shift their weight, or whinny for their morning rations. But when Piel touched the flank of his own mount, a 6-year-old bay gelding named Donner, the surface felt like marble. The temperature had dropped to -4 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. But that alone couldn't explain what Lieutenant Piel was seeing, because these horses hadn't just died from the cold. They had died standing up, simultaneously, without a single sound that alerted the guards posted just 30 yards away. But the truth was far more terrifying than simple exposure could ever explain. Before we uncover the truth about the Hessian Cavalry horses and what really happened during that frozen Christmas night in 1776, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We dive deep into the forgotten horrors of history that textbooks conveniently leave out. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's return to that terrible morning in Trenton. The winter of 1776 was the crucible in which American independence would either be forged or shattered forever. By December, General George Washington's Continental Army was disintegrating. The initial fervor of revolution had given way to the brutal reality of warfare against the most powerful military machine on earth. Men were deserting in droves, enlistments were expiring, disease ravaged the camps. Thomas Paine would write that these were the times that try men's souls, and he wasn't exaggerating. Across the Delaware River, occupying the small New Jersey settlement of Trenton, sat approximately 1,400 Hessian soldiers. These weren't British regulars, but German mercenaries, professional soldiers from the Principality of Hesse-Kassel, hired by King George III to suppress the colonial rebellion. They were led by Colonel Johann Gottlieb Rahl, a veteran officer who had fought in multiple European wars and considered the American rebels little more than armed farmers playing at war. Trenton itself was a prosperous small town of perhaps 90 families, situated strategically at the falls of the Delaware River. Its stone houses and well-maintained roads made it an ideal winter garrison. The Hessians had requisitioned homes, stables, and warehouses throughout the settlement. The locals, many of them loyalists, sympathetic to the crown, had little choice but to comply. The Hessian cavalry horses were quartered primarily in 3 locations: the Potts farmstead on the northern edge of town, the Douglas estate stables near the river, and a converted Quaker meeting house that had been stripped of its benches to accommodate 24 mounts. These weren't ordinary horses. They were specifically bred cavalry animals from the German states, larger, stronger, and more disciplined than typical farm horses. Some were worth more than a year's wages for a common soldier. Cavalry Master Ernst von Altenbochem maintained meticulous records of every animal under his care. His journal, preserved in the German state archives in Marburg, reveals a man obsessed with the welfare of his charges. He recorded their lineage, their feed consumption, their moods, their injuries. These horses were pawns of war, certainly, but von Altenbochem treated them with the care most men reserve for their own children. December 25, 1776 was a Wednesday. Christmas was not yet the sentimentalized holiday it would become in later centuries, but for the German soldiers it held cultural significance. Colonel Rahl had authorized extra rations of rum. The men played cards, sang songs from home, and tried to forget that they were 3,000 miles from their families, occupying a hostile foreign land in the dead of winter. The weather had been deteriorating for days. A nor'easter had swept down from Canada, bringing with it temperatures that plummeted to levels rarely seen in New Jersey. The Delaware River was choked with ice floes. Snow fell intermittently, sometimes as delicate flakes, sometimes as pelting sleet that stung exposed skin like needles. But something else was happening that Christmas night. Something the Hessians didn't know and couldn't have anticipated. 9 miles away, on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, General George Washington was preparing to stake everything on one desperate gamble. He would cross the ice-choked river with 2,400 men and launch a surprise attack on Trenton at dawn. It was a plan born of desperation, with odds so long that even Washington's own officers questioned its wisdom. In the stables of Trenton, the Hessian Cavalry horses stood in their stalls, unaware that they had less than 8 hours to live. December 24, 1776, 2:00 p.m. The first unusual incident was recorded in Cavalry Master von Altenbachem's journal with characteristic precision. 3 horses at the Potts farmstead, stalls 7, 8, and 9, refused their afternoon feed. This was noteworthy because cavalry horses maintained rigorous schedules and rarely declined food. Von Altenbachem personally examined each animal, checking their teeth, their eyes, the warmth of their muzzles. He found nothing wrong. Their vital signs appeared normal, yet they stood motionless in their stalls, heads lowered, seemingly staring at the stable floor. When he clicked his tongue, the universal cavalry command that typically prompted any horse to attention, they didn't respond. Private Hans Müller, who had been responsible for the care of the bay in stall 8 for nearly 6 months, told von Altenbachem, "Sir, he won't look at me. I've never seen anything like it. It's as if he's listening to something I cannot hear." Von Altenbachem dismissed this as superstitious nonsense, though he noted it in his journal. By evening, the 3 horses had begun eating again, and the incident was forgotten. December 25, 1776, 10:00 a.m. Lieutenant Piel was conducting morning rounds when a courier arrived with disturbing news. At the Douglas Estate stables, night guards reported that around 4:00 a.m., all 27 horses had become agitated simultaneously. They had not whinnied or kicked their stalls, behaviors typical of spooked horses. Instead, they had pressed themselves against the back walls of their enclosures and trembled violently for approximately 7 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the behavior stopped. The horses returned to their normal resting postures as if nothing had happened. Guard Corporal Wilhelm Stern had been on duty. His report, filed with the garrison command, is preserved in the Hessian military archives. "I have served with cavalry units for 9 years. I have seen horses panic during artillery bombardments. I have seen them react to predators, to fire, to the smell of blood." This was different. They were terrified, yes, but it was a coordinated terror. They moved as one organism. When it ended, several had bitten their own tongues. Blood dripped from their mouths, but they made no sound at all. Lieutenant Piel investigated personally. He found the blood, small pools of it beneath several stalls. He also found something else that he mentioned to no one except his private diary: strange patterns in the frost that had formed on the stable walls overnight. The crystalline formations seemed to swirl in spirals, all rotating in the same direction, all centered on a point approximately 4 feet off the ground, roughly the height of a horse's head. He attributed this to unusual weather phenomena and ordered the stables to be swept clean. December 25, 1776, 6:00 p.m. As Christmas dinner was being prepared in the houses commandeered by the Hessian officers, von Altenbachem made his final evening inspection of all 3 stable locations. The temperature was dropping rapidly. He ordered extra straw bedding for the animals and ensured that stable doors were properly secured to retain whatever warmth the horses' bodies would generate overnight. At the converted Quaker meeting house, something caught his attention. Every single horse, all 24 of them, was standing facing the same direction, northeast, toward the Delaware River. Horses in stables typically orient themselves randomly or position themselves near their feed troughs. But these animals stood in perfect alignment, as if on parade ground formation. Von Altenbachem walked among them, touching their flanks, speaking softly in German. They didn't acknowledge his presence. Stablemaster Dieter Vogel, a civilian contractor hired to maintain the facilities, approached von Altenbachem with visible anxiety. "Sir, there's something you should know. My grandfather kept horses in Prussia. He told me stories about the winter of 1740, during the War of Austrian Succession. He said that before the Battle of Mollwitz, the cavalry horses all stood facing the same direction the night before. Every single one, 300 horses, all facing east toward the enemy lines. The next day, most of them died." Von Altenbachem snapped at Vogel to keep such superstitious tales to himself and dismissed the man from duty. But privately, the cavalry master was disturbed. He ordered guards to check on the horses every hour throughout the night and returned to the officers' quarters where Colonel Rahl was entertaining his command staff with cards and brandy. Von Altenbachem said nothing about the horses' behavior. In the midst of war, with Washington's army believed to be in full retreat in winter weather providing natural security, such concerns seemed trivial. December 25, 1776, 11 p.m. The temperature had now fallen to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Guard Corporal Friedrich Bauer was making his hourly check of the Potts farmstead stables. The building housed 47 horses, the largest concentration of the Hessian Cavalry mounts. Bauer carried a covered lantern, his breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. When he entered the stable, he immediately noticed something wrong. The building was silent, completely silent. No shuffling of hooves, no breathing sounds, no movement of any kind. For a moment, Bauer thought every horse was dead. Then, as he raised his lantern higher, he saw that they were all standing motionless in their stalls. 47 horses, perfectly still, all facing the same direction, northeast, toward the river. Their eyes were open. Vapor rose from their nostrils, so they were breathing. But they appeared to be in some kind of trance state. Bauer approached the nearest stall, a gray mare named Greta. He extended his hand to touch her neck. The mare's eyes swiveled to look at him, but she didn't move otherwise. The eye was dilated far beyond what the dim lantern light would require. The pupil was enormous, black, reflecting the flame in a way that made Bauer take an involuntary step backward. He would later tell investigators that in that moment, he believed he was looking not at a horse but at something else wearing a horse's form, something that was aware of him but considered him irrelevant. Bauer completed his check as quickly as possible and returned to the guard post. He noted in the log that all horses appeared healthy but were behaving strangely due to cold weather. I did not mention the eyes. He did not mention the absolute silence. He told himself he had imagined it, that the cold was affecting his own mind. At midnight, the temperature reached -4 degrees Fahrenheit. It would not get any warmer for the next 9 hours. At that same moment, 9 miles away, George Washington's men were beginning to load into the Durham boats that would carry them across the Delaware River through the ice and darkness. The Hessian horses remained standing, motionless, facing northeast. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and forgotten history, because what happens next, what Lieutenant Piel discovered at dawn, would become one of the most suppressed military reports in Hessian records. Let's discover what happens next. December 26, 1776, 6:47 a.m. Lieutenant Jakob Piel was awakened by musket fire echoing through the streets of Trenton. Washington's forces had crossed the Delaware and were attacking from 3 directions simultaneously. The surprise was total. Hessian soldiers stumbled from their quarters in various states of undress, struggling to form defensive lines in the snow-covered streets. Colonel Rahl attempted to rally his men, but the situation was chaos. American artillery was firing down King Street. Musket volleys came from behind houses and walls. The Hessians, professional soldiers all, fought with discipline despite the confusion, but they were being overwhelmed. In the midst of this battle, someone, records don't specify who, shouted for the cavalry to mount up and conduct a flanking maneuver. It was a sound tactical decision. The American forces were primarily infantry. A cavalry charge could break their formations and allow the Hessian infantry to regroup. Lieutenant Piel, bleeding from a minor wound to his shoulder where a musket ball had grazed him, ran toward the Potts farmstead with 5 other cavalrymen. They needed their horses. They needed to turn the tide of this disaster. He reached the stable doors at 7:23 a.m. We know the precise time because his pocket watch, damaged by moisture and blood, stopped at that moment. The watch is preserved in the New Jersey State Museum. Piel pulled open the heavy wooden doors. Gray dawn light filtered into the stable. For a moment, he would write later, he thought his eyes were deceiving him, that the chaos of battle had damaged his perception. 47 horses stood in their stalls exactly as Guard Corporal Bauer had last seen them 6 hours earlier, motionless, facing northeast. But now, in the morning light, the reality was undeniable. They were dead, all of them. Not collapsed, not fallen, standing upright, their legs locked in position, their bodies rigid with rigor mortis and cold. Ice had formed across their coats in crystalline patterns. Their eyes were open, glazed, frozen. Several had frost forming delicate structures around their nostrils where their final breaths had condensed and frozen. Piel approached the nearest horse, his own mount, Donner. He placed his hand on the animal's flank. The body felt like stone. The cold had penetrated so deeply that the flesh had frozen solid. But the horse was still standing, its weight perfectly balanced on 4 legs that had gone rigid at the moment of death. The other cavalrymen who had followed Piel into the stable stood in shocked silence. One of them, Private Georg Schneider, would later testify that he checked every single stall. Not one horse had fallen. Not one had thrashed or kicked or shown any sign of struggle. They had simply stopped living while standing in perfect formation. Outside, battle continued. Musket fire echoed. Men shouted in English and German. Colonel Rahl was rallying his forces for a counterattack that would ultimately fail. But inside the stable, there was only silence and 47 frozen corpses standing like statues. Piel had no time to investigate further. The battle demanded his attention. He and his men retreated, fighting their way back to the main Hessian defensive positions without cavalry support. But within 2 hours, similar reports came from the other stable locations. At the Douglas estate, all 27 horses were found dead, standing upright in their stalls. At the converted Quaker meeting house, 24 more frozen corpses stood in formation. In smaller stables scattered throughout Trenton where individual officers had quartered their personal mounts, the pattern repeated. Every single cavalry horse in Trenton, 103 animals in total, had died simultaneously, standing up, facing the same direction. By 9:00 a.m., Colonel Rahl had been mortally wounded. By noon, the Hessian forces had surrendered. Over 900 German soldiers became prisoners of war in what would become the Continental Army's first significant victory. The horses remained standing in their stables for 3 more days before anyone had time to investigate what had happened to them. The initial investigation was conducted by Dr. Johann Edelman, a military surgeon attached to the Hessian forces who had been captured along with his regiment. Washington, demonstrating the pragmatism that would characterize his leadership, allowed Dr. Edelman to examine the horses while being held as a prisoner of war. Dr. Edelman's report, submitted on December 29, 1776, is a masterpiece of clinical observation under impossible circumstances. He began with external examinations. Every horse showed identical presentation, standing upright, legs locked in rigor mortis, eyes open and glazed, mouths either closed or slightly open with feet still present. The ambient temperature had remained below freezing, which had preserved the bodies in their death positions. When Dr. Edelman attempted to tip one of the smaller horses to examine its underside, he discovered something extraordinary. The animal did not tip over like a rigid statue as expected. Instead, its legs, frozen to the stable floor by moisture and cold, broke at the joints with sounds like snapping timber. The horse collapsed and in doing so revealed the underside of its hooves. Every hoof showed deep scoring marks, as if the horse had been trying to dig into the floorboards. But the marks were perfectly parallel, regularly spaced, as if the horse had been scratching at the floor with mechanical precision for an extended period. Dr. Edelman found these marks on every horse he examined. The animals had been clawing at the ground beneath them while standing perfectly still. The contradiction was impossible, yet the physical evidence was undeniable. He then attempted necropsy examinations on 4 horses. The frozen flesh made this extremely difficult, but Dr. Edelman was thorough. What he found challenged everything he understood about animal physiology. The horses' hearts had stopped simultaneously. He could tell this because blood distribution patterns indicated that circulation had ceased at exactly the same moment across all 4 specimens. The blood had pooled in the lowest extremities according to gravity, suggesting the hearts stopped while the animals were standing. But there was no evidence of cardiac damage, disease, or trauma. The lungs showed signs of what Dr. Edelman described as crystalline intrusion. When he thawed tissue samples, he found that the alveoli, the tiny air sacs in the lungs, contained unusual ice crystal formations that had apparently formed while the animals were still alive. These crystals had the peculiar characteristic of all being oriented in the same direction within the lung tissue. Most disturbing were the eyes. When Dr. Edelman examined the retinas of several horses, he found burn patterns. Not thermal burns, the tissue showed no signs of heat damage, but the photoreceptor cells were damaged in ways consistent with exposure to intense light. Yet the deaths had occurred at night, in closed stables, during one of the darkest periods of the lunar cycle. The report concluded with Dr. Edelman's professional opinion. These animals did not die from exposure to cold, though the cold preserved their bodies. They died from a phenomenon I cannot explain with current medical knowledge. If I were pressed to provide a cause of death, I would say they died from terror, but terror so profound and instantaneous that their hearts simply ceased functioning simultaneously. The Hessian command, now prisoners of war, were shown Dr. Edelman's findings. Captain Ernst von Altenbochem, the cavalry master who had cared for these animals, requested and was granted permission to read the report. He then sat down and wrote a 17-page addendum documenting every unusual behavior he had observed in the 3 days leading up to the animals' deaths. Von Altenbochem's addendum would not surface in historical archives until 1923, when a German researcher discovered it misfiled in military medical records in Marburg. In it, Von Altenbochem drew a map showing the precise orientation of every horse at the moment of death. When the individual stable locations were plotted on a larger map of Trenton and the surrounding area, every single horse had been facing the exact same point, a specific location on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, approximately 9 miles northwest of Trenton. That location was McConkey's Ferry, the exact spot where George Washington had begun crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night. Von Altenbochem noted this correlation but made no interpretation of it. He simply wrote, "I document this for future investigators. I offer no explanation." The Continental Army's response to the horse deaths was markedly different from the Hessian investigation. General Washington was informed of the unusual circumstances on December 28th by his quartermaster, who had hoped to claim the horses as spoils of war. Washington's recorded response was brief: "Remove the carcasses. We have neither time nor resources to contemplate mysteries." Orders were given to burn the bodies. However, the logistics of burning 103 frozen horse carcasses in the middle of winter proved prohibitive. Instead, on December 31st, 1776, a detail of soldiers was assigned to remove the horses from the stables and bury them in mass graves. The soldiers assigned to this task later reported, in letters and diaries that have been collected by historians, that the experience was deeply unsettling. The horses had remained standing for 5 days. When soldiers attempted to drag them from their stalls, the animals' legs broke at the joints, frozen solid. The sound, multiple sources noted, was like trees breaking in ice storms. One private, Samuel Richardson of the Connecticut militia, wrote in his diary, "We buried them in the field north of town. Took us 2 days to dig through the frozen ground. The horses looked at us as we dragged them, though they were surely dead. Their eyes seemed to follow our movement. When we tipped them into the graves, they shattered like porcelain dolls. I will not soon forget the sound." The burial site was unmarked and quickly forgotten as the war continued, but the incident had ramifications that extended far beyond that frozen field. British military command, upon learning of the Hessian loss at Trenton, conducted their own investigation into the horse deaths. A British cavalry officer, Major Charles Dunsworth, reviewed Dr. Edelman's report and von Altenbochem's addendum in early 1777. His assessment, filed with General William Howe's headquarters in New York, dismissed the unusual circumstances as environmental factors combined with poor animal husbandry. However, in the margin of his report, visible only in the original document held in the British National Archives, Dunsworth wrote in small script, "If true, Washington crossed while the German horses died. What manner of man holds such power?" This marginal note would become the foundatio, and of persistent rumors in British ranks that Washington possessed supernatural abilities, rumors that British command worked actively to suppress but could never entirely eliminate. Among the Hessian prisoners of war, the incident took on folkloric dimensions. German soldiers, holding to older European traditions, interpreted the horses' deaths through the lens of battlefield omens and premonitions. They spoke of the incident in their prisoner camps, and when they were eventually repatriated to Germany, they carried the story back with them. In several German military academies in the late 18th century, the Trenton horse incident became a case study, not in veterinary medicine or battlefield tactics, but in what was called Schlachtfeld Vorahnung, battlefield premonition. Some military theorists proposed that animals, being more attuned to natural phenomena, could sense impending major events. The horses in this interpretation had sensed the approaching American army and died from the shock of that knowledge. No serious scientist of the era accepted this explanation, yet it persisted in military folklore. The frozen horses of Trenton disappeared from official historical records almost immediately after the event. Neither American nor British military reports gave the incident more than passing mention. Dr. Edelman's detailed medical examination was filed and forgotten. Von Altenbochem's addendum was misfiled. The burial site was plowed under for farming within a decade. For over a century, the incident existed only as footnotes in obscure military documents and as folk stories passed down through the families of soldiers who had witnessed it. Then in 1876, exactly 100 years after the event, something unusual happened. A military historian named Friedrich Weber was researching Hessian participation in the American Revolution for Germany's centennial commemoration of American independence. He stumbled across references to the Trenton horses in multiple separate documents: a quartermaster's log, a prisoner of war diary, a letter from a German soldier to his family. Each mentioned the unusual circumstances of the horses' deaths. Weber became intrigued. He spent 3 years tracking down every reference he could find, eventually locating Dr. Edelman's original medical report in Munich and von Altenbochen's addendum in Marburg. In 1879, he published a scholarly article titled Die Toten Pferde von Trenton, ein ungeklärtes Phänomen, The Dead Horses of Trenton, an Unexplained Phenomenon, in a German military history journal. The article caused a minor sensation among military historians and was quickly translated into English. For the first time, the general public learned of the incident in detail. But the article also caught the attention of another group, veterinary researchers. In the 1880s, veterinary science was emerging as a professional discipline. Dr. James Henderson, a veterinary researcher at Cornell University, read Weber's article and became convinced that the Trenton horses had died from a previously undocumented condition. He proposed that extreme cold combined with stress could cause simultaneous cardiac arrest in multiple animals confined in close quarters. Henderson's theory was never proven, but it established the Trenton incident as a case study in what we now call environmental stress response in animals. Veterinary textbooks in the early 20th century occasionally referenced Trenton when discussing how environmental factors could affect large groups of animals simultaneously. More significantly, the incident influenced military thinking about animal logistics in warfare. The Trenton horses demonstrated that cavalry mounts were vulnerable in ways that military planners had not fully appreciated. During the American Civil War, several Union cavalry officers specifically referenced Trenton when arguing for better winter provisioning of horses. The incident had shown that even well-cared-for military horse could die en masse under the right conditions. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I, the Army Veterinary Corps used the Trenton incident as a historical precedent when arguing for mobile veterinary hospitals on the battlefield. They pointed out that the Hessians had lost their entire cavalry capability overnight due to unexplained horse deaths, a vulnerability that modern military forces could not afford. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Trenton horses was cultural rather than military. In the Delaware Valley region of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, the story became embedded in local folklore. By the early 20th century, residents of Trenton told stories about the frozen cavalry every Christmas season. The tales grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some said the horses still stood in ghostly formation on cold winter nights. Others claimed that on December 25th you could hear phantom hoofbeats along the Delaware River. These stories were dismissed by historians as folklore with no basis in fact, until Friedrich Weber's 1879 article proved that the core incident had indeed occurred. This pattern, folklore preserving historical truth that official records had forgotten, became a subject of scholarly interest in the field of oral history. The Trenton horses demonstrated that folk stories, however embellished, sometimes contained kernels of documented historical events. In 1926, the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Trenton, there was a brief attempt to locate the mass grave where the horses had been buried. A local historical society, working from Samuel Richardson's diary and other primary sources, identified a likely location in a field that was by then part of a dairy farm. Limited excavation was attempted, but the precise burial site could not be confirmed. The project was abandoned. The field is now part of a shopping center parking lot. Modern investigations into the Trenton horses have been limited but intriguing. In 2003, a team of veterinary pathologists at the University of Pennsylvania reviewed all available historical documents about the incident as part of a research project on mass mortality events in animals. Their conclusion was cautious. While the historical record clearly indicates an unusual mass death event occurred, the available evidence is insufficient to determine a definitive cause. The most likely explanation involves a combination of extreme environmental stress, possible environmental toxins, and coincidental timing. That phrase, coincidental timing, is significant because it acknowledges what no one in 1776 could have known, that the horses died at almost the exact moment George Washington's army began its crossing of the Delaware River. Was it truly coincidence, or was there some connection between these two events, one that we lack the scientific framework to understand? The question remains unanswered. What we do know is that the Trenton horses represent one of the strangest footnotes in American Revolutionary War history. 103 military animals, bred and trained for war, died simultaneously in a manner that defied the medical understanding of their time and continues to resist easy explanation today. They died standing up, facing the same direction, with looks of terror frozen in their eyes. And in dying, they may have changed the course of American history, because their deaths meant the Hessian Cavalry could not respond effectively to Washington's surprise attack. The victory at Trenton revitalized the Continental Army and gave the Revolution new life. Sometimes history pivots on the smallest details. On this occasion, it pivoted on 103 frozen horses standing silent in the Christmas darkness. What do you think really killed the Hessian Cavalry horses? Was it simply extreme cold and stress, as the scientists suggest? Or was there something more? Some phenomenon we still don't understand about how animals sense impending events? Leave why. Our theories in the comments below. Do you believe the horses somehow sensed Washington's crossing? Or is there a more rational explanation we've overlooked? And if you're from the Trenton area or have family stories about Revolutionary War history, we'd love to hear them. Our community of history seekers includes people from all over the world, and your perspectives make these investigations richer. Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of American history, the stories that are too strange, too disturbing, or too unexplainable for mainstream textbooks. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Until then, remember, history is full of mysteries hiding in plain sight. Sometimes all we need to do is look. See you in the next video.